Tēnā koutou katoa. I ngā mātā waka, nau mai haere mai ki te Herenga Waka. Koutou i tai mai, i runga i ngā tai e whā o te ao. Koutou o te rohe o Amerika ki te tonga. Tēnei rā te reo o mihi kia koutou. Nau mai haere mai ki te Herenga Waka. Me te tuku atu anō i ngā poroaki ki tērā o ngā rangatira o Chile i mate i Parekurehia ki roto i tētahi o ngā tahuna mahuika ki reira. Nō reira kei te rangatira tēnā rau atu koe. Moi mai rā, oki mai, hoki mai ki te hunga ora kia tātou kua pai nei. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora everybody and welcome to this evening's event from the Latin American Cape, lifting our sights on cooperating with Latin America. My name is Professor Rawania Higgins and I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Māori and Engagement here at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington, and a member of the Management Committee for the Capes. It is my pleasure to have you all with us this evening, and my particular greetings go to the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, His Excellency Alfredo Perez Bravo of Mexico, to his fellow ambassador from Peru, His Excellency Mr. Jose Bastainza, and to the representatives of the embassies of Argentina, Brazil and Chile, the British High Commission and the European Union delegation, and many other dignitaries who are in the room. And if I keep naming everybody, we'll run out of time for the kōrero tonight. So I'm going to, in my Te Reo Māori acknowledgement, in my mihi, I wanted to pay acknowledgement and send the university sincere condolences to the families of the former president of Chile, who the recent loss of life in forest fires, and we acknowledge those as part of our culture. As Māori, we always acknowledge those who have passed in our recent past, and so I feel it's appropriate to also acknowledge their passing. To the officials of our government agencies, MFAT, Ministry of Ed, I'm just going to read the acronyms because it's quicker, MPI, MB and TEC, and the leaders of Export New Zealand, Universities New Zealand, New Zealand Institute of International Affairs, and last but by no means least, I want to acknowledge this evening's speakers, because that's why we're all here. Our former Trade Minister, Ambassador to the US and the WTO, the Honourable Tim Groser, and the Principal Economist of NZIER, Chris Nixon, and our three commentators, Sarah Lee of MFAT, who I just met tonight, Bryce Edwards and Malcolm MacKinnon. We are here to launch and discuss a piece of research the Latin America Cape commissioned last year on diplomatic like-mindedness and collaborations between Aotearoa, New Zealand and Latin America. I'm not going to go on to too much more because we really want to be able to listen to the people who have participated in this. So on behalf of Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington, it is our pleasure to be part of this evening, but more importantly to be part of the Latin America Capes and the research and engagement that has happened over the past few years in our council chamber, where the Capes were launched and announced by the then ministers at the time, and of course having everyone here today to be part of this evening is truly special to be back in this room again. So I'm just going to hand it back to my colleague Matthew to do more of the introductions. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora wania. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. It's great to have you here. You're not here to see me, so I'll go really quickly. Most of you by now know what the Capes are. If you don't, really quickly, 4 universities, 3 centres, Asia Pacific focus. We run programs, resources and initiatives to introduce the people of New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand, to the and businesses and policymakers and students and teachers to our region, and specifically for the Latin America Cape, the region of Latin America. Some of you won't know, I think most of you will, but welcome if it's your first engagement with us. We're based here at this university, at Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. We're New Zealand's only publicly funded entity focused on Latin America. Isn't it boring when people just read out lists like this? So I'll ad-lib a bit. As you've heard by the people who are here tonight, the calibre of the people, we've got some fantastic friends and allies and partners. It's great to have you here. One thing we love doing is actually connecting audiences. People, we'd like to bring businesses and students and the community and all sorts of people together, and that's what we've done in the past. We particularly like putting Latin America on more New Zealanders' radars because it's still a fact. We're proud of our work, but it's still a fact, and it may be a fact for another 10 or so years, that New Zealanders often don't get the Latin American opportunity, even that it is an opportunity. So we're keen to do that. Because we're based in a university, we have a privileged access to students and the next generation of leaders. So building a new generation, a cohort of leaders, is really important to us. If you want to find out the programs and resources that we do, look at the link you'll see on the website. I don't have time to open it up. Look the link you see on the screen. This is a chance to do a bit of publicity. We've got a heap of activity coming up in the next few months. In a couple of weeks, we're going to be launching a wayfinding tool. That's to visualise data, put it in compelling visual form, to show people, actually, there's quite a lot happening, to surface what's happening. Yesterday, rather early this week, the Trade Minister confirmed that he will do an event with us on Peru's APEC year. Welcome to the Ambassador of Peru as well as the Ambassador of Mexico. We've got polls of the public and businesses to promote. Thanks to our friends in New Zealand International Affairs, there's a March issue on Latin America coming out of the New Zealand International Review. We didn't write it, but we contributed to it. There'll be delegations to Latin America, Winds of Change, a climate change program, a group of alumni to Mexico, high school students with the Young Enterprise program to Mexico. Fingers crossed, I should have put an asterisk beside it. We've got to work on the dates. University research delegation to many countries, and the third edition of the Aotearoa Spanish Language Week, which our Governor-General opened last year. Why are we here tonight? Well, go back about two minutes to what I said about putting Latin America on more New Zealanders' radars. We've got to change conversations. We've got to show Latin America's importance to New Zealand. Almost all, hopefully all the people in this room get it, but that Latin America is important to this country. But many people don't. And so we've got to try and find ways, provocative ways sometimes, or new ways at least, to get people thinking about this relationship. And sometimes we've got to challenge entrenched views that this region is actually worth engaging with. Some don't think so. So we've done a series of reports. Last year 2022, we did one on the economic opportunity. We've got a couple going at the moment, bubbling away. One is on supply chains and clean energy transitions. Another is on how Australia and New Zealand can collaborate to engage Latin America. We've just published another call for research on New Zealand, Latin America and the Blue Pacific, and I'm pleased to say tonight we're also going to do a final one in these next few months on New Zealand, on Latin Americans in New Zealand and their contribution to our society. So to find out more about that, again, there's a link that you can jot down or I can make available to you afterwards. I should say this event is being recorded, so if you want to watch these links more slowly, that is another opportunity. Origins of today's report. Well, some of you know that I used to be an academic, and as an academic I was aware of diplomatic collaborations between New Zealand and many of the nations in Latin America. And last year we did a panel at an anniversary event on diplomatic relations with Mexico, celebrating multilateral collaborations. And that actually attracted a lot of people in what was a really exciting event. So we thought we'd explore this in a bit of depth. We put out a public call with terms of reference. Thank you to our colleague Sarah, who will be speaking later, for helping with the terms of reference. We formed an advisory group to advise the chosen authors, and tonight you're hearing the author's response to that brief. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is call up one of the authors, Chris Nixon, Principal Economist of the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research. Apologies, Chris. And Chris will give a first presentation, and then we'll pass over to his co-author. Thank you.
Kia ora and welcome. And welcome to this beautiful venue. You know, the Institute does between 240 and 300 projects a year. Some of the hardest projects we have to do are the ones where the economics doesn't quite align with the client's expectations. This is not one of those projects. The important thing about this project, and I'm going to go into why I've just said that, is the connections between New Zealand and the world and how that impacts on New Zealand. When we're talking about those connections, what we're really interested in from an economic point of view is growth. And I think it's a really great opportunity now to ask that question about growth. Where is it going to come from? But first of all, you know, why is growth important? Growth is really important for New Zealand because it gives us choices. It gives choices to individuals, it gives choices to family, and it gives choices to the economy. This is why we strive in this direction. And I need to be very clear about this. We are not an institute which believes in zero growth. And the reason we don't is because, for example, 20% of our GDP, which is about $60 billion, goes on health and education. We want choices for our people in health and education. And growth delivers that. It doesn't mean unconstrained growth, but it's really important if we want to progress as a society. This is our problem. You know, here we are with a sort of a 2,000 kilometre circle around New Zealand. It takes in half of Fiji, plus a few penguins, and the 5 million New Zealanders. If you put the same circle in in North America or in Asia, here I've just done it for Europe, you've got 360 million consumers. Scale and distance are our problems. And so we have to find innovative ways around our problem. We're at the bottom of the world, or perhaps halfway between Latin America and Asia. We need to be aware of this, and we need to think about how we get around this. And yes, it is about productivity. The point is, how do we sustain a gentle wind of innovation that grows our economy? Yes, it's also about capital labour substitution, upskilling our people. These happen over time, making it easier for business to do business, within reason, of course. But also, it's about the effectiveness and efficiency of our foreign and trade policy. This is critical for our growth, one of the critical things for growth. And so when I think about that, I think about Who are our foreign and trade policy candidates over the long term? It means we can't chop and change. I did remind someone earlier that, at one point we did have an embassy a high commission in India, but for political reasons we withdrew. We require a consistent approach to the world, and that requires a certain amount of fixed cost. And that's where I think we've got to focus on all of our opportunities, including Latin America, sorry. So why is that? And why is it important now? It's important now because the world is a less benign place. Just a little reminder, one of the reasons why we have tariffs on New Zealand aluminium and steel going into the United States is because we've been deemed an unfriendly nation. Just a little reminder. But resilience in this terms has its price. We have to cast our trade policy and our foreign relations net widely. And as I said, that requires resources. And just also to point out to you that to make things happen is actually hard work. Opportunism is not easy. And it's not easy when resources ebb and flow. So for those three reasons, the Institute are very, very strong about the intensity of our international connections. We must keep our eyes on the prize. It is about foreign and trade policy, and it requires a long-term commitment. And we are a trading nation. Our relationships are vital and do partly shape our growth path. And the reason why our growth path is important is because it gives us choices. And just to look at the report for one moment, essentially what we do in the report is look at the ties that bind. The flow of ideas and commerce are the important things which drive our relationships. And that should be the case with Latin America. Like-mindedness is really about bringing together a coalition of the willing. We don't have to agree on everything with people, but we do need, as a small nation, to connect and drive our relationships. And in the paper, we do go through some case studies. We look at the Cairns Group in the Uruguay round. We look at cooperation in terms of disarmament. And we also look at the Global Research Alliance, which is based in Uruguay. So while those are the case studies, the ties that really bind are around developing international rules, the themes associated with that. Not only developing international rules, but ensuring that those rules are enforced. Neighbourly relations, the Blue Pacific, Antarctica, these are all important. And we have connections with Latin America because of that. And we will continue to have those relationships. Trade facilitation. The first trade relationship came about in 1909, I think it was, when we sold Corriedale sheep to Argentina. There's a long history there, but the history is discontinuous. So we need to actually ensure that we are able to develop an opportunistic approach here. But to be opportunistic means we have to be there. And last but not least is people-to-people relationships. So if I was to leave you with one thing, it's about durability of connection, consistency of commitment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. As you'll see, Chris's presentation wasn't focused specifically on individual points, but they can come up in questions. In case those of you you've resisted the temptation to open up so far, it is on page Roman numerals 3, what those exact cases are, and there are examples of specific collaboration. But I'd now like to invite our other speaker, our other main author, the Honourable Tim Groser, to supplement and add to those remarks with his own reflections on this project and its significance.
Well, kia ora tātou, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, ambassadors, representatives of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished guests, and a special warm welcome to many people, I will not start to name them, with whom I have worked over many years, mainly in MFAT, on what is really the underlying project driving this piece of work that I've helped put together with Chris. I'm very pleased that you're in the room, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, because it gives me a very thin excuse to tell a slightly self-indulgent story about the last time I had some formal role in this building, in the council building. This was over half a century ago, and I was there in two capacities. One was president of the Victoria University Socialist Society, which, as I like to point out, and I'm looking at Peter Cullen, at least metaphorically speaking when I say this, is the perfect training for any future National Party cabinet minister. And the other was student representative on the University of Council. And the then Vice-Chancellor, a very lovely guy in every sense of that word, Dr. Danny Taylor. There'll be a few people in the room who will remember him. He was Vice-Chancellor here for many years. I had to go and see him because the administration of the university had introduced cuts in the university library hours that were extremely inconvenient for the student body to save a very small sum of money. So I developed, through consultation, an alternative strategy to save the university exactly the same amount of money, but in a way that was far less disruptive to the student body. And I called on Danny in this very building, and Danny looked at my proposal and said, "Oh, it's a very good idea. No, we can do this." So I then went back to report in triumph to the Student Representative Council, expecting bouquets, a wider range of potential girlfriends, and God knows what else. But instead, a certain gentleman, whom I will name, got up and proposed a vote of no confidence in me. Because while I had achieved the objective that the students wanted, I had used bourgeois negotiating techniques to achieve this, and had failed to understand the nature of the student-worker struggle that we were engaged upon. That person was Rob Campbell, somebody I'd worked with since the age of 12, and with friends like Rob, you don't need enemies. And I would just simply say, when I think about some recent political events, rien n'a changé au fil des années. Nothing much has changed with the passage of time. So it's a great pleasure to be back here in a slightly different mode, slightly different subject, but I hope with a better result. And I'm very strongly committed to this. I think Chris is absolutely right to have set this within the framework of an outward-looking, growth-oriented policy approach, which I unashamedly support. It's not growth at all costs. We need to take account of a series of other issues in framing growth-oriented policies, but when you examine almost any group's demands, they all want more resources. And the only way to try and expand the range of opportunities for people is, of course, through higher productivity growth in the main part and higher input growth. It's about economic growth. And for those people who have consistently opposed every single trade agreement that New Zealand has ever entered into in the last 40 years with strong bipartisan support from Labour-led and national-led governments, they have never explained to New Zealanders how on earth they imagine New Zealand could maintain a first world economy without participation in what are designed to be deliberately discriminatory agreements. So that's the broad framework. When it comes to Latin America, the core message of this report, for those of you who at least will read the key points part of it in the first few pages, is that one has to see this in the context of a much, much longer campaign by 3 generations of New Zealanders to try and diversify the structure of our external linkages. And the report starts with history that's very familiar to me and a number of other people in this audience, because a number of other people in this audience have been engaged like me in the same grand project. Starts with this single astonishing statistic from 1950 when New Zealand sold 90% of its exports to one country, the United Kingdom. Even in 1973, when the European Union, when Britain went into the then EEC, the European Economic Community, that figure was, I think, 44%. When one thinks about the level of concern in Australia and New Zealand in terms of our dependence on the China market, I think in 2022, 27% of New Zealand exports went to China. This astonishingly large figure represents the scale of the challenge faced by both political leaders and officials like me. I was then a junior Treasury officer at the time, to actually cast a strategy that would solve a monumental problem for New Zealand. And the key message of the report is to see this as a continuation of that logic. And it records some of the key signposts, but the common element behind those very successful long-term strategies that 3 generations of New Zealanders have played an important role in is, first of all, we have to set our sights high. Secondly, it does involve a coherent whole-of-government approach involving many different parts of New Zealand society and stakeholders. My first diplomatic experience and job was to play a role in sorting out our relationship with Australia. And as a very young New Zealand diplomat, I was sent off around all 6 states of Australia in 1976 in anticipation of a visit by the then Deputy Prime Minister and Trade Minister Brian Tallboys. And here is the extraordinary fact: no New Zealand minister had gone to each of the Australian states for 60 years or something like that. In other words, we had looked at Australia as if it were on a giant reflecting mirror in London. Our relationship with Australia was a triangular one, not a direct bilateral relationship, and we had to change the mindset of New Zealanders. So that was in 1976, only 3 years after Britain essentially disrupted the trading relationships of a very large number of countries, including very many Latin American countries, which also had an important stake in providing foodstuffs to the British market and to some extent the wider continental European market. And while a CER agreement came out of that, the origins of it are that broader view. And the strengthening of our relationships with Asia, if you go through the diplomatic history, is exactly the same. a conscious decision by New Zealand governments, whatever their political complexion, to establish stronger embassies, stronger programs of cooperation, civil aviation links, education links, as well as exploring the opportunity for direct trade liberalisation as these economies developed. So there is nothing in this report that is, in a sense, distinctive. It is just focusing on this very important part of the world, 650 million people, and asking some very obvious questions. Why are we so thin on the ground in Latin America? Now, there are some very obvious reasons for this. First of all, we have very few resources. It's a country of 5 million people. Secondly, unfortunately, while there are success stories in parts of Latin America, and certainly when I think of Mexico, huge progress in Mexico in the last 25 years, it has not developed to the same extent or rapidity as was the case with Asia, and the fundamental driver behind this diversification strategy for us in Asia. But I think in terms of diversification, it's pretty much like a portfolio investment. The more opportunities you have, the better you will perform. And when I've used in the report the example of our largest single exporting company, Fonterra, $20 billion of dairy exports. They go to 140 different countries. So the more the New Zealand government can improve the terms of access, can help them promote the image of New Zealand, the more opportunities it gives. And I can only see that logic being strengthened by closer ties with Latin America. Now, in practice, we have focused very strongly on the trade and economic relationship for very good reasons. It's not that we, I'm speaking really with my 30-year-old MFAT hat on when I say this, it's not that we don't understand the importance of other agendas, and we worked very closely with a number of Latin countries on issues like disarmament, human rights, and other matters. But the natural common interest in global trade liberalisation and access to the major markets of the world is something that we have shared very strongly with a number of Latin American countries. And as our chief negotiator in the Uruguay round, the last successful multilateral negotiating round, I worked incredibly closely with a number of the Latin countries, such as my colleagues from Argentina, from Chile, from Peru, from Brazil and others, trying to build the case. Essentially, what we in Australia did was, within the Cairns Group, was to use the political power and greater weight of the world of Latin America to gain leverage and establish ourselves as the third force in those negotiations alongside the European Union and alongside the United States. I'm getting signaled down, so I need to wind up. So the basic lesson is this. We need a greater coherence in our approach to Latin America. We need greater consistency. We need, as Matthew's pointed out, resources to do it. It doesn't happen magically. And I think we must focus on a few of the, I think, 56 countries of Latin America? Something of that ilk? Yeah. Well, okay, I'm getting confused perhaps with another data point, sorry. But with a large number of Latin American countries, I think we feel most comfortable with the Pacific Alliance, but the Mercosur countries still a very, very important focus and will always be a very important focus for New Zealand. So, ladies and gentlemen, you know, various politicians have put various degrees of emphasis on Latin America, starting with Helen Clark, who has a consistent record of support for Latin America, and a few others, including myself. I also want to acknowledge the tragic death of President Pinheiro, whom I met a number of times, mostly with John Key, but sometimes by myself when I went as an observer to Alianza del Pacifico meetings. And I just hope that we can strengthen the amount of resources and the political commitment to developing this relationship in greater depth. Thank you very much. Kia ora.
Thank you, Tim, and before him, Chris. We're going to now call on some panellists to offer some comments on the report, and then there'll be a time for questions, both of the panellists and of the speakers themselves. So that's what we've got coming up now. So I'd just like to invite our panellists to join me up front here. Sarah Lee of MFAT, Unit Manager for the Latin America, for the Americas Division. Dr Malcolm MacKinnon from this university, from the School of History, Politics, Philosophy and International Relations, and Bryce Edwards from the Democracy Project. So please come and join me, folks. There'll be a general question to everyone and then an individual question to each. So you've each come to the project at a different stage. Sarah, you helped us design its terms of reference, and we're part of the advisory group who the authors spoke to, because there were a few iterations, as you'd imagine. A salute there to Joshua Tan of Export New Zealand, who was also on the advisory group. Malcolm, you're on the advisory group too, because we are based universities, so we always want an academic input to what we do. And Bryce, you're like most people in the room who only came to this report maybe a few hours ago, a few minutes ago maybe. And so you've got a different response to it. You've only seen the finished product. You had no responsibility whatsoever. So can I ask each of you, just in turn, to describe your response to the work, highlights, anything that particularly interested you or even surprised you? So, Malcolm, you're closest. Shall we start with you?
Thank you, Matthew. Kia ora, everyone. And great to have the opportunity to respond to the report. A bit harder in a sense because I already knew it, so it's not like I'm going to be suddenly surprised. But I'll just pick out three things that I think would strike anyone reading it for the first time. One was the salience of China in the narrative about New Zealand relations with Latin America, and that may come up in our discussions as we go down the track, and it reverberates in a number of different ways. Second was something that Tim partly talked about, which was the areas of convergence. And while I kind of knew that as headline terms, actually reading about the detail of the Cairns group of the New Agenda Coalition and the extent of diplomatic intimacy, if you like, that is really below the radar. And this comes back to the key purpose of this whole exercise of ordinary New Zealanders was also very suggestive. The third thing, I guess, that I don't quite know how to phrase this, but the constant reminder of the heterogeneity of Latin America, that it's almost every statement you make about it as a region, you have to qualify in some fashion. And so that was a third thing, and I think I will now pass on to Bryce.
Thanks, Malcolm.
Okay, kia ora. I come to this debate really as a total layman on Latin America. I have no background in this region. Trade policy also isn't my area, but nonetheless I do have a few things that I've noticed about it. And yes, I only just did read it just before stepping up. But what I hadn't seen highlighted anywhere else ever is the commonalities between New Zealand in terms of foreign policy, trade relations with Latin America, especially in terms of New Zealand's involvement in intergovernmental organisations, the UN, etc., on disarmament, climate change, agricultural policy. There's a lot more synergies there than I had any idea about. And secondly, what fascinated me the most was the author's use of the theoretical tool of Inglehart's map of cultural values, which you can see on page 9. And I found that as a particularly fascinating idea of trying to work out New Zealand's relations with different cultural and value-laden sort of parts of the world. And I'd be interested in discussing with the authors a bit more about unpicking that, really.
Thank you. A bit like Malcolm, I feel a little bit well, I wouldn't want to pretend that I was surprised by this, given A, I worked with the Cape and its development, and B, that it is my pleasure to be able to work in this area every day, every week, every month, and I'm really excited to be here. I get the opportunity to geek out in public about our links with Latin America. But what I did want to commend and steal shamelessly, if I may, authors, is the gentle winds of innovation concept, because I think it so well describes what we have been doing with and in Latin America with the various partners for so long. New Zealand's sort of work and approach to our relationships in Latin America has never been big bang. It's always been about the consistent, which I hope will continue, the consistent development of new ideas, the consistent working together in other multilateral fora to build partnerships. It's about long-term partnerships, and that's advice we give to New Zealand businesses as well. You don't succeed in Latin America without investing in consistent and long-term partnerships, And it's about identifying gaps and opportunities where we can work together and collaborate and converge and make use of that. So I really enjoyed that phrase. I'm going to, if I have permission from you both, I'm going to use it and steal it myself. And Chris, your comments about growth at the beginning also made me connect to that phrase. Growth can be gentle, and sometimes is best to be so, and that's sometimes the advice that we give into New Zealand businesses. Go in there slowly, be in there for a long time, and you will absolutely see the benefits. And growth gives us choices. And so I look forward to hearing what everybody has to say about how we make the best of those choices coming up.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all. Now a question for each of you. Firstly to Malcolm. Malcolm, you've written extensively on New Zealand's international relations history, including a book I used to make my students read in my undergraduate history courses. You've also done some research on Mexico. Can I ask you to comment on the description of New Zealand's trade history as you know and as people will discover is presented in this report? In particular, the central claim that Tim particularly referred to, that our relations with Latin America have to be seen in the context of a broader history, including our relationship with Asia. So can you just reflect on that point?
Of course. Thank you, Matthew. On the first one, the history, I was very struck and would concur with the author's argument about the critical nature of what happened in the 1970s. And they mentioned about European UK entry into the EEC. But I would probably take it a bit further and say there was so much else going on in the 1970s. It was an extremely unsettling decade in a whole variety of ways. It was the decade of the oil crisis. It was when, because of détente, suddenly there was an opportunity to trade with communist countries in a way that had not been thought about before. It was a decade when we had the legendary fish for beef dispute with Japan. In other words, there was a whole variety of ways in which New Zealand had to confront economic dealings which were not supported by a friendly diplomatic substructure. And part of the reason I think it's worth dwelling on that is because in some respects I think we're back in that situation in the 2020s, that in the period in between, which we might call the sort of the Asia-Pacific era, in many ways our security and strategic interests and our economic interests seem to be aligned. That wasn't particularly the case in the 1970s, and it's not seemingly the case in the 2020s. So I thought that was a really interesting thing to come out of the report, or that I chose to take out of it. The second thing in relationship to the more general point about Asia-Pacific, and I guess that you can perhaps draw it out from what I've just said, and I will make this, it's clearly in the 2020s a commonality in terms of the extent of economic relations with China, both in Latin America and in New Zealand, which did not exist 30 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. But I also think it's probably important not to forget about the United States. And with respect to His Excellency the Ambassador for Mexico, I would just make that point in particular about Mexico, which joined APEC in 1993, which was really the year that the United States discovered APEC. And there was the first heads of government meeting at Seattle, and of course a year later there was NAFTA. Now all of that became very problematic during the Trump administration, both the withdrawal from really any engagement with the Asia-Pacific economic architecture on the part of the administration and the difficulties that NAFTA faced. But the fact of the matter is that some of the byproduct of that, and this is stranded through the report, is one of the reasons why Mexico is so important is because its level of economic integration with the United States is so substantial. And indeed, it was an interesting story in the New York Times just today, I think, saying that in 2023, the United States imported more from Mexico than from China. This was because imports from China declined, but it's still an interesting comment. And therefore, I think when we talk about Asia-Pacific, while we need to think about that role that China plays in the economic architecture and how Latin America and New Zealand have common interests in that respect, there's also something going on with the United States, even despite that country's problematic issues with international economic diplomacy. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Malcolm. Sarah, one for you. The focus for much of the report is on the past and the lessons we can get from the past. But as in your role as head of MFAT's Latin America unit, you have to keep very abreast of the present. And you have to know what is happening today in the areas referred to. So just can you give us some examples of current collaborations in some of the areas identified in the report?
Thank you. I try to keep abreast, but that's why we have experts in so many areas, many of whom who are here. So please call me out if I'm getting things wrong. But I did want to focus on the section of the report which is called, or it has part of its title, on common threads combining to produce benefits. Because this is where I have to do my work, and if I'm doing it properly, in each of the 6 areas, I will be able to deliver wins with many, many colleagues for New Zealand. There's developing, I think Chris had them up on the PowerPoint, but the 6 areas were developing international rules, reinforcing international rules, neighbourly relations, which I love because it highlights things like the fact that when we work together with Latin American partners on birds, it's because birds fly between us. It's not because there is a sort of created human reason for having to do that work. Anyway, I digress. Bird conservation and health issues are my favourite. Trade facilitation, opportunism, and people-to-people contact are the 6. So I've got a couple of examples, not to say, well, we're already doing this, but to sort of highlight the fact that when we do this over many years, we can create that gentle wind of innovation together. So the first one I wanted to focus on is around developing and reinforcing international rules, and it relates to a really amazing resolution that New Zealand and Mexico led last December in the United Nations General Assembly. The resolution has a catchy title, which was the Resolution on Implementation of the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the optional protocol thereto, Situations of Risk and Humanitarian Emergencies. Behind that very catchy title is an example of really superb collaboration with a key Latin American partner in New York. So New Zealand and Mexico have for a number of years been running resolutions in the United Nations in relation to the Convention on the Rights of Peoples with Disabilities. And about every 2 years we try and run a resolution like this. And we've developed a reputation that we do this deliberately, we do it carefully, and we do it in a really transparent and open way. And gradually it means that those resolutions can be more can tackle newer and more controversial topics. And in this particular instance, it was the first resolution passed in the General Assembly on the topic. It managed to achieve consensus, which was great. And quite spectacularly, I think, we together managed to get 92 co-sponsors for the resolution. And that is in a situation where engaging in a multilateral context on what happens in situations of conflict is quite hard right now. So I really like that example. It shows how long-term, gentle, transparent connections to our values can really pay off for some important work. There were two things I think that helped us achieve that result. One of them was New Zealand and Mexico having shared values about how we do things in the United Nations, including how to be transparent, how to be fair, to make sure everybody's views were heard, because there were, of course, a range of views. And when you trust each other's values, you can act consistently with them. And the second one was sustained diplomatic outreach to a wide range of countries. And I mean, somewhat obviously, I can point out that when there's two of you, you can do that better than when there's only one. And you can talk in different ways to different coalitions or to different groupings. So that was my favourite example. We also work day in, day out, month in, month out, to try and facilitate trade between New Zealand and our various partners in Latin America. We do that not alone. We work very closely with other partners, New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, MPI, and Education New Zealand in the education space. But together we try and remove barriers so that it is more straightforward for our businesses to connect with their Latin American partners and their Latin American opportunities. So a couple of examples, just to sort of highlight the fact that we are working together to try and innovate. New Zealand and Chile working really hard together to try and get e-certification up and running so that goods can be traded between us much more straightforwardly for our businesses in both directions. We've, just to respond to the point about Mexico's connections in with the US. So one thing we're doing a lot is trying to identify what barriers we can remove for New Zealand businesses who wish to set up in Mexico and move into the US market. Businesses like Fisher & Paykel Healthcare is a good example. And working on just the full range of goods trade as well. So getting our wine with the right pieces of paper attached into Colombia. That's been a project that we've been working on recently. We also have had these long-standing, as the report's authors pointed out, initiatives that just keep on delivering for us. And one that I wanted to give a particular shout out to was the GRA, because I've seen my GRA friends today, and because it really is a great example of the fact that not only can we develop international rules, but sometimes we can also kind of go around them and work with our partners to say, okay, well, the international rules are developing in this way. What can we do to support each other and ourselves to be ready for those conversations? And that was a great example of that. Two food baskets of the world, I suppose, working together. And opportunism, I really loved that one. I've got a great opportunity for opportunism, if I can use that sentence, this year. The G20 in Brazil, we've got the APEC in Peru. Again, thank you, Ambassador. And just really encourage you all to take the time to look at what our Latin American partners are doing at the moment and saying, and how they're managing to bring the world to those conversations.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm conscious of the time, but we've got some gold here, and there's still going to be time for questions. So, Bryce, your question is really picking up a little bit of what you're talking about before. You're not an expert on trade policy or Latin America, but you are, I believe, because I read your reports every day, an expert on trying to form public opinion. And so this subject, what we're trying to do here is form public opinion. We're trying to get people excited by Latin America through this report, through all the reports that we're doing, and understand its relevance. So what's your experience through the Democracy Project, or any comments you'd like to make as a result of that experience? How do you try and encourage New Zealanders to take an interest in a subject that they've hitherto not really engaged with or had the opportunity to engage with?
Yes, I think it's going to be very difficult for this particular report and this project because New Zealanders aren't particularly interested in foreign affairs, foreign policy, and particularly not the Global South and Latin America. And so, I think in many ways things are getting worse at the moment. Under the last government and this current government, we're seeing a bit more of a return to the Anglosphere and away from the Global South. And of course, there's always a tendency to, blame the public for this, blame the voters or blame the people for not being smart enough. But I think as academics and public intellectuals, we really have to acknowledge that I think the problem starts at the top. There's a lack of leadership. And I get contentious here probably, but New Zealand's foreign policy community, I think, is quite dysfunctional, quite backward, quite inward looking, and they're very focused on the Anglosphere. They're not really about encouraging debate. We have a Wellington establishment that doesn't really want these sort of issues discussed amongst everyone. It's really for the experts, and I think that's a real problem. And it's a problem that if we continue down this focus on just our traditional partners and Anglosphere and our big trading partners, it means, yes, we get New Zealanders to focus on Canberra, Washington, London, and Tokyo as well, and Beijing, but we stop them from having a bigger, wider picture of the world. So I think in many ways our foreign policy community does let us down, and that whether it's MFAT, whether it's Asia New Zealand Foundation, they don't encourage and foster that focus on the Global South. So I guess what I'm saying here is that, yes, there's some elements that the government likes to pretend at least it's focused on the Global South, maybe in the Pacific, but even that is more about military and geopolitical primacy, in terms of China, etc. And we just don't really have that tradition. So even I note that, once we were over COVID, Hipkins, as Education Minister, went off to Latin America to, start talking about New Zealand opening up to the world, but it wasn't followed through with any Prime Minister visit, and it's unlikely to in the near future. Instead, we had the government just cutting things like CAPES. Instead, we had the government cutting funding for language schools. But I think the future definitely is about needing greater resources for language schools, for future diplomats, and for things like what we're seeing in this report and CAPES, which is really thin on the ground in New Zealand at the moment.
Well, thank you, Bryce. We wanted the reports to be provocative. Those are some provocative statements. So one person's put his hand up, but before that person, I asked that person to speak. Can I actually invite our two speakers to also come up to the stage here, and then we can begin the conversation. So I know who the speaker is, but not everyone will. Could if you've got a question, please wait for the microphone to come to you, because that way we'll know it's been captured on the recording. Say who you are very briefly, make a question, not a statement. Go for it.
Good evening, thank you all. My name is Charles Finney. I'm an evil political lobbyist here in Wellington. I'm also known to a number of the people in this room who would know that I'm far less diplomatic than Bryce. So I have a question here for the authors. As Groser will know, I've been working on the Latin America relationship for over 30 years, 35 I think, going back to Mexico's GATT accession. But I know Chile best. And if you look at the relationship with Chile, you have to be disappointed, even though we've got a great architecture in place. There's been a long-standing free trade agreement partner of ours, and this has continued to develop through the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or Comprehensive and Progressive Partnership, we can now call it. We haven't really grown our goods trade, and in the services trade area, we are going backwards. And in the investment area, where this used to be a strength, we had billions of dollars of investment in the Chilean economy. Carter Holt Harvey had major forestry investments. Fonterra owned Saprole. We had fisheries investments. We had oil and gas investments. We've now got nothing. Air services, we've gone backwards. International student numbers are coming down. Why is this happening? Did your research cast any light as to, in terms of economic theory, we should actually be going forward. We've got the right architecture in place, but it's not happening for that bit of Latin America, and I suspect several others.
Well, that's a very broad question. Let me focus on bits of it. First of all, with respect to our record of foreign investment in Chile, which I'm very familiar with this background, Charles, and I think this reflects a wider problem in corporate New Zealand. And this has been the case for decades. There may even be a few people who will remember that Alan Bollard, who was, I think, then the director of the New Zealand Institute for Economic Research, wrote a very brief book, about 100 pages, detailing the extraordinary underperformance of New Zealand companies investing everywhere outside New Zealand, starting with Australia. I can even dimly remember the average internal rate of return on those investments in Australia was something of the order of 5 or 6% compared with some much larger figure like 10 or 12 within New Zealand. So I think this goes back a long, long way. And for the life of me, I do not know how governments can fix this. The people who make the decisions are New Zealanders or residents of New Zealand working in those corporations. And their record for 30 years has been very, very poor. I don't think you can blame any New Zealand government for this. I don't think there's anything the New Zealand government has done in these areas. I remember over the Saprole, I wouldn't call it a disaster, but huge disappointment. Since I have particularly close relationships, as you do, with two very, very important Chilean people, Ricardo Lagos Jr. and Alejandro Jara. And they have been colleagues of you and me over many different enterprises involving Chile and New Zealand very successfully, including, the whole TPP exercise, P4, and now the next generation of MFAT officials has used Chile as the launch pad for DEPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. So I don't think with respect to Chile, the problem rests with the New Zealand government. On Saprole, I recall I went down to, I've forgotten the name of the southern Chilean city. I went down there twice, once with the Prime Minister. I managed to persuade the Prime Minister to come down and save that foreign investment. This is a public forum. I have strong views about what went wrong in terms of Fonterra's management of that. But it comes down to, actually, if you want a blunt answer, the failure lies in corporate New Zealand, not in the New Zealand government hands. With respect to education flows, well, don't get me started on the idiocy of the decision to kill the international education industry completely needlessly during COVID. Of course, we had to shut down our tourist industry because the average stay of a tourist coming into Aotearoa is 9 days. We're going to have 14 days in isolation for a 9-day visit. But we could, if the MB had been, and the leaders of the country at the time, had used a little more common sense to convert, for example, student halls of residence into temporary MIQ facilities, there was absolutely no reason to kill that $5 billion industry and all the externalities that go with greater student links. So, in that case, it was the fault of government, not the government, obviously, of the party that I eventually ended up in. But if the national government had made the same decision, I can assure you I'd make exactly the same criticism. So I think it's a very broad question. New Zealand has underperformed. That's the bedrock point you're making. And I think there's a variety of different explanations behind it, not a single one you can lay at the foot of the government on all issues, on all these failings.
Chris, do you want to respond to?
Just to say that I'd rather not look backwards, I'd rather look forward. Tim's got some clear points of view. I don't have enough information or knowledge of those particular examples that you're quoting. But I'm just here to say you've got to keep at it. The government has to keep at it. It's about incrementalism. We've got to keep going. What's happened in the past, we've got to learn from that, and we've got to move on. And the point about a gentle wind of innovation is where I'm at. This is what we've got to do, and we've just got to get up and go again. We have no other option.
As you see the report, you'll see phrases like coalition of the willing appearing a few times here, and opportunism, but obviously considered opportunism as well. Any other questions from people? Yes.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koe, Embajador Matthew Craig, thanks for organising, tēnā koe, Bryce, and tēnā koutou katoa to the panel. My name is Natalia Albert, and I am a Mexican-born New Zealand citizen. I have been here for 13 years, and this conversation has been very helpful, and I will read the report with interest. I would just like to ask a question at a micro level. This has been a meso-macro kind of level conversation of what the government has done and trade agreements and the UN, and that's a very institutional kind of approach to our relationships with Latin America. And I just want to give a personal example and I guess a bit of a plug and just ask for some advice and kind of your perspective on this. I have identified an opportunity, like was said, where Mexico is at the forefront of digital accessibility, right? And there's a gap in New Zealand in digital accessibility. None of the websites are accessible, right? And Mexico has a product that's forward-thinking, very innovative. And so when I started to kind of chip away at how you can bring a product from Mexico to New Zealand, there was nothing. All of the focus is on the New Zealand market going to Latin America. And I feel it's a massive blind spot that, one, pisses me off personally because I feel it's a bit arrogant. And two, when I do want to bring up products that I think there's a massive need in New Zealand, I don't really have anywhere to go. And so I wanted just your perspective from MFAT and previous politicians and academics. New Zealand Trade and Enterprise doesn't help, MB doesn't help. I reached out to Craig and Matthew, and they're like, I don't know, we'll think of someone. But there's no one or no institution that helps products that are leading in Latin America, like the one I came across for digital inclusion, to bring to New Zealand. So I just wanted some perspective, advice, and what you thought about that. Kia ora.
Thanks. Thank you. Nice to see you. And I can see the frustration. I think what I would say is that we are sometimes a little hamstrung by doing things the way that we have been doing, and we do need people to force us into perhaps maybe less gentle ways of innovation. But I would really suggest that you reach out to Latin America Business Council, to embassies, multiple, who are based here, who have, as part of their kind of passion for the New Zealand Latin American trade, a desire to increase the visibility and the presence of really good Latin American products here in New Zealand. And you can always email me, you know where I am. But the things that I can do to help are limited when I am about looking after our outward perspectives, but I can always connect. Any tips from this direction? Tips from this direction?
I'll just briefly say that if we are refunded, we'll do a study on importing to New Zealand. Okay?
I'll start lobbying.
Good on you.
Well, just as an economist, you see, I'm interested in exports just as much as I'm interested in imports. And well, both, basically. So the more trade begets trade, as far as I'm concerned. But we have these mercantilistic views of the world. Imports are bad, exports are great. And actually, it's not actually helpful from an economic perspective. Because as you say, you bring in products which help New Zealanders. But this is what you're fighting. And unfortunately, you're the bleeding edge. No, you're not crazy. But that's I'm someone who floats over the top of these things, so I don't have that individual.
Well, speaking about floating over the top of these things, I'm conscious that we probably need to wrap up because we're well over time already, and some people may need to head away. Just a final opportunity for any of the panellists or the speakers to respond to what another panellist or speaker has said, if any of you want to have any remarks.
Well, no, I just want to thank, from my point of view, NZIER and Chris for providing me with the opportunity to come into this debate, and for you, Matthew, and your colleagues here. I mean, I think we've just got to take a long-term view of this issue, and we're not going to solve the underperformance of New Zealand and Latin America easily or quickly, but I mean, I think it was you, Bryce, said it. Certainly others have said similar things. I mean, it does start at the top. And so we will need a commitment. I actually think, honestly, we had that commitment from John Key. He went twice, I think, to Latin America. And I think he understood the need for that, to provide leadership at the top level. I'm hopeful Chris will see it in the same way. He, after all, will be very much aware of the Southern Link argument, and his background as CEO of Air New Zealand, I think, will probably be a useful starting point. But if anyone has ever worked for a Prime Minister, I've worked with about 6 incredibly closely, they haven't got time to brush their teeth, let alone think about strategic long-term issues.
We're good there otherwise. Very, very brief comment, I believe, from the Ambassador of Peru, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you very much. Very briefly, Matthew, thank you very much to you and CAPE for organizing this event. I cannot think of any institution in New Zealand that has made more for the development of relations between New Zealand and Latin America than CAPE, and I hope you will continue doing this for many years to come. Second, I would like to join you in expressing our condolence for the passing of President Sebastián Piñera. If you allow me, Juan, with the pass away of President Piñera, not only Chile, but the whole Latin America has lost a very important political leader, because he was a true Democrat, he was a man of dialogue and a man of peace. Third, I was not able to attend the Waitangi meeting because I was abroad, but I pay very carefully attention to the speech. From very far away, I pay attention to the speech of Prime Minister Lacson. And it is a very clear guide for countries like Peru that want to develop relations with New Zealand. But especially 2 phrases really strike me. He said, for example, imagine an outward-looking country hustling and connected to the world, so it's easier to make the most of all the global opportunities that exist. He also said, imagine a country that embraces technology and innovation to reduce our isolation, and so we can sell more valuable exports and earn bigger incomes. Well, Latin America can play a very important role in dealing with this isolation. New Zealand can really connect South America, Latin America with, I mean, you call it the global South. No, the global South with the global North. You really can play a very important role. I cannot speak for Mexico, I cannot speak for Chile, I can speak for Peru. In Peru, we are having soon the new transshipment port of Chancay. We're going to have the new Lima Airport International City, which will be one of the most important air terminals in Peru, in Latin America. This will connect with Callao Port through a special economic zone. So what we need to do is to identify these opportunities to connect, for example, New Zealand to these logistic and transportation hubs in Latin America. This is the case of Peru. I'm sure Mexico and Chile have also options for New Zealand to study. But this is what we have to do. I think Latin America can play a very, very important role in connecting New Zealand with the rest of the world. thank you, and I apologize for taking so much.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think we'll wrap it up there. This is really the opening salvo in a series of public events we'll be doing. I mentioned them before, I won't mention them again. We've floated a lot of subjects, we've barely scratched the surface of most of them. Nevertheless, we can have other opportunities to engage. So please come along to our other events. Everyone who came here tonight will be invited to the other ones. I'll advise you all in good time. For now, though, I want to thank you for sitting with us for a little longer than we planned. I'm keeping you from a drink. Please join me now in thanking primarily our authors, but also our panellists for their thoughts tonight. And please discuss with them what you think about the work or questions you have about it over drinks. Thank you very much for coming.